I'm not saying that those movies produced equivalent art to The Offspring. I'm just using an extreme example to make a point. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that when you wax poetic about the legendary pop-punk bands from the late 90s and early 2000s, it probably takes you just a little while to get to The Offspring. And that's pretty amazing when you think about how massive The Offspring were in the 90s and early 2000s. But over time, it feels like they've been slightly forgotten. They're not irrelevant, but they're in this weird place where they're not fully embraced by any constituency that would have been part of their fan base. Now, before you get the knives out, I'm admittedly making a broad generalization. I'm sure there are Offspring superfans in the 2020s. I just haven't really met anyone yet. I wanted to make this video not to denigrate the Offspring, but to just explore some of the reasons they don't seem to have the same nostalgic currency that some of their peers receive. But before we go into the reasons, let's rehash their history really quick. Formed in Southern California in the early 80s, the Offspring eventually began to generate buzz towards the end of the decade before finding themselves signed to a still developing Epitaph Records. While they found moderate success with their initial two releases, everything changed for both the Offspring and Epitaph with 1994's Smash. And Smash would go on to become the best-selling independent album of all time. After some bad feelings between the label and the band, the Offspring departed Epitaph for Columbia Records. And in 1998, that move absolutely paid off when they released Americana. This thing was huge. The Offspring were so big in this time period, they actually played Woodstock 99. And if you look at that lineup, there's not a lot of punk rock representation on that thing. The success of Americana moved the Offspring from like a viable punk band to a mainstream fixture. Although they would never match the success of Americana, subsequent releases, The Conspiracy of One and Splinter, also found pretty decent success. And since then, the band has really slowed their output, but they've settled into this nice little role as the elder statesman of punk rock. And it's this role as punk rock veterans that really intrigues me about the Offspring, because they just don't seem to get the same veneration from their fan base as everyone else that they would naturally be compared to. So let's get into it. I'm going to propose a few theories as to why the Offspring get no respect.
I mean, that's the story of my life. No respect. I don't get no respect at all. No respect at all.
They lack star power. Be honest, it'd probably be better for your overall health to spend a weekend with the Offspring than spend like 30 minutes with Fat Mike. But who's going to choose to spend time with the Offspring over Fat Mike? I mean, the Offspring seem like well-adjusted, productive adults, and that's great for them and their families. But not always what the fans look for. And I don't want to come off sounding like your punk rock heroes should all end up as some Sid Vicious Darby Crash. No. It's great that the Offspring seem like absolutely normal people. And it's awesome that Dexter Holland is part of the punk rock PhD club. And I always think Noodles gives great insights in interviews and podcasts. But those qualities, they don't necessarily leave a lasting impression. In one sense, it's refreshing to see how relatable the Offspring are. But it's also unfortunate that the individual members seem to lack the charisma of their peers. Think about the personalities in the Offspring and compare those personalities to people like Billy Joe Armstrong or Mark Hoppus. It's really not a comparison. Their humor doesn't hold up. Let's face it, regardless of the medium, comedy never really ages too well. And this isn't meant to be some kind of anti-cancel culture rant or whatever. All I'm saying is that the specific comedy that the Offspring engaged in really doesn't hold up in today's landscape. Some of the humor from a band like Blink-182 might not fit into the 2020s because of evolving social norms, while the Offspring have some songs that definitely fit into that category. I mean, come on, a song like She's Got Issues would never be made today, or at least it wouldn't fly too well. But specifically what I'm talking about here is the type of humor that's only relevant during a given time period. Sure, there's something timeless about a suburban white guy cosplaying as a boy from the hood, but that joke had more currency in 1998 than it does today. There's always a risk when you make contemporary references. Kind of reminds me of those movies that were mass-produced a few years ago. Look, those movies weren't even that great when they came out, but now you need like the Wayback Machine just to get the references. To be clear, I'm not saying that those movies produced equivalent art to The Offspring. I'm just using an extreme example to make a point. Don't tweet at me. Or do. Also, that Waterboy drop in Original Prankster, it's not good.
You can do it!
They embraced a different type of pop music. Look, every band with roots in a punk scene will take some flack when they hit it big, and the Offspring were no exception. But they were a band that settled on a little bit different path to mainstream viability. This is not universal, but it's a safe assumption to say that In the context of punk, it's some sort of homage to the Beatles. And the Offspring have plenty of classical pop influence in their music, but they actually took their pop sensibilities into a different direction. In the present day, we're in a bit of a post-genre era of music, but that overt fusion of the genres really was a product of the 90s. And the Offspring in many ways are a band that fits perfectly into the 90s landscape. They deserve credit for taking these chances with their music. I have no doubt that a band at that level could have pumped out some cookie cutter albums and still moved plenty of units. By embracing the spirit of the moment, they secured a spot in the normie consciousness of the day. And unfortunately, that's where I think they remained. Like the comedy, the bells and whistles of their production choices get your attention. But once the novelty wears off, the songs, they're kind of forgotten. And it's not to say the Offspring are flimsy songwriters. If anything, Dexter's very underrated in this category. But I do think the broader masses didn't see that other side of the band. And like any pop act, once the moment is gone, people move on to the next hot thing. Bands like Green Day and Blink-182, they might not have always had their best work topping the charts, but their songs still have a timeless quality that'll never really go out of fashion. Whereas I think the Offspring's big songs are just moments of fashion. And the last reason, they never really fit into any punk paradigm. For the reasons I've just stated and many, many more, the Offspring have never been embraced by any punk subculture. Even before they broke, I don't get the impression they were fully embedded in the underground scene. It seems like they might not have been completely in the club. And on top of that, they became successful while they were underground. They didn't bring a big fan base to the mainstream. They already found that fan base when they were still kind of underground. So they had that the whole time. Now, all that I said might be irrelevant, but when you think about it, they didn't have this legion of punkers that felt betrayed when they went to Columbia. And sure, that's a thing that can be alienating to a lot of people, but as their star faded, they would have maintained some of those fans, and they simply never built that fan base. The hardcore Offspring fans were likely the same people that listened to whatever alternative radio it was producing in the 90s. And as is a common theme in this video, once something else is fresh, the fans, they move on. Also, this might be a bit of a copy and paste take from my Green Day video. Please go watch it. But I think they were also a generation removed from what we think of as the pop punk of the early 2000s. The difference between them and Green Day is that in 2004, Green Day re-embedded themselves in the pop punk conscious with American Idiot. Let's be honest, at that same time, the Offspring were really fading. The Offspring are kind of like the middle child of the genre. Life is unfair. So where does that leave us? It feels a little strange that a band I have such high regard for, I just spent like 10 minutes seemingly trashing. But again, that was not my point in the video. I just wanted to examine the why. Why is it that the Offspring are not put on that pop punk pedestal with so many of these other bands that are their peers? And as I said before, people can like whatever they want. And if the Offspring aren't your thing, that's fine. But I do think we should all appreciate what they meant to the overall growth of pop punk. What do you think? Are the reasons I stated for their lack of respect valid? Am I overestimating the apathy towards them? Sound off down below in the comment sections. Talk to you next week.